Now, next week, Angolans will vote in what is expected to be a contentious contest between the opposition and the ruling party, which has held power for nearly 5 decades. Since its independence from Portugal in 1975, the MPLA has ruled the Central African country under Joo Lourenço's leadership. However, Unita, a stalwart opponent, is more powerful than ever as frustration increases over the government's inability to use massive oil revenue to improve living conditions for all. The election's lack of credibility is the main worry yet again. Experts say that one cannot guarantee the validity of the poll because voter polling is a recent development in Angola. For more on this, we speak to Stellenbosch Professor of African Studies, Dr. Justin Pearce. Doctor, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. Now, Angolan President Joo Lourenço of the MPLA movement is seeking a second term when the country heads to the polls on Wednesday. However, the opposition party, Unita, is accusing the ruling party of trying to create a single-party state. What do you think is the contributor to these political tensions in Angola?
I think it's a ruling party, as you said, has been in power ever since independence in 1975. There was a first attempt at multi-party elections in 1992. That process was interrupted by the resumption of the civil war. Angola finally achieved peace in 2002. And it was the MPLA, I think, managed to take credit for ending the war and for finally bringing about peace in Angola. And it was on that basis that the MPLA contested the first elections after the end of the civil war. Dos Santos, the then president, putting himself forward as the architect of peace. And, you know, in those early years after the war, they were helped by a worldwide boom in the oil price. Angola is a major oil exporter. And its economic growth was phenomenally high in the years from about 2004 to 2014. Now, various things happened as a result of that. The very wealthy, including those connected to the MPLA, became even richer. Nothing much changed for the poor at all, so the country became more unequal. There was a middle class that did reasonably well in that process, who got used to a rising standard of living. I think all that changed in 2014. The world oil price went down. Angola has been in a severe economic crisis ever since then. 2017, President Dos Santos, who is now getting old, decided to hand over to Joo Lourenço, who was duly elected 5 years ago. However, I mean, Lourenço has battled to deal with the long-term structural inequalities in the Angolan economy. Meanwhile, the opposition parties have become better organized, and I think as the memory of the civil war has gone further and further into the past, the stories about the war are no longer so significant for younger generations of voters who now comprise the majority of the electorate.
Most certainly, and I mean the Constitutional Court ruled in May that Unita could form a coalition to contest as it had planned to with 2 other minority parties. And like you say, it also seems that more of the Angolan youth are gravitating towards the opposition party. Now, Lourenço seems to be threatened by all of this growth, and as we've seen Unita accusing the ruling party of causing disturbances at their rallies, could this be an election that tips the scale for the MPLA?
I think it's going to be very close indeed. You know, Lourenço's first strategy when he took over from Dos Santos was to distance himself from Dos Santos by investigating cases of corruption from the previous regime. I think that he bought himself some goodwill by doing that, but that strategy couldn't last forever. And, you know, November 2020, we started to see more protests against the old issues of unemployment and poverty. All of that has brought us to a situation where it's going to be a very tightly contested election indeed. However, it's not clear whether the election will be free and fair. The Electoral Commission is dominated by the government and by the ruling party. In the 2017 election, there were all sorts of complaints raised about a lack of transparency in the vote counting process. So that if the MPLA feels that things are not going its way, it certainly has the means at its disposal to alter the election results in its favor.
Now, citizens are growing increasingly agitated as the oil wealth, and like you mentioned, that Angola being the second biggest oil producer in Africa, does not trickle down to the people, and living conditions just continue to worsen. Angola remains highly dependent on oil, as it constitutes 90% of all the exports and roughly half of their total GDP. How do you then foresee the ruling party, who has been in power for almost 5 decades, possibly making a positive turn on this particular issue?
You know, it's something which has been talked about literally for decades. Even as long ago as the 1980s, the Angolan government was talking about trying to diversify the economy away from oil. And you know, I think as the economy became ever more oil dominated in the early 2000s, you know, this was something that was said repeatedly. It was the advice of international financial institutions, as well as political pressure from within the country to diversify the economy. It never happened for some reason. I mean, partly because I think for those who were doing well out of the oil boom in Angola, there was really no incentive to do things differently. And you know, I think as the oil price slumped, again, there were these calls to try and do things differently. But, you know, I think however much political will there may be to do this, it's as if the MPLA hasn't quite figured out how to do it. There are gestures, but in a way, the old way of doing things still continues. And while there've been some measures, you know, particularly amid the economic crisis of the last few years, it's been an incentive for more agricultural production in the country, rather than importing food from outside. So there have been small steps, but I think, you know, there's a fundamental transformation that still needs to happen, and nobody seems to be quite sure how to do it. And in any case, it's a long-term process. It's not going to be something that will happen quickly enough to satisfy immediate political demands.
Now, you mentioned in an article that discontentment over the ongoing issues of inequality and unemployment is likely to be sharpened by the wake of an election result that lacks legitimacy. Now, you also mentioned that in a fair competition there would be an outright win for Unita. However, how credible do you think that these results will be, also knowing that Angolans will now be able to vote from across the globe, and those election numbers would be tallied in the capital of Angola?
Sure. I don't think the diaspora vote is going to make a big difference one way or the other. That is a new development in this election, as you say. I do fear there will be problems around credibility. Just, you know, a lack of independent oversight. What happened last time was that the MPLA declared victory the morning after the elections, before the results had even been properly added up. When the opposition parties and some civil society groups raised concerns at the last election over the process, these were dismissed by the Electoral Commission and then by the courts. So I fear that if this happens again, and if there has been an upswelling of voting for the opposition, people are going to feel that their votes haven't been counted, and the process won't really be enough to calm those fears.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Pierce. That was Dr. Justin Pierce, who is a professor of African Studies at the University of Stellenbosch, unpacking for us the Angola general elections and what the impact will be on the polls with regards to this instability that exists in that country.